Welcome, gentle listener. Tonight, let us draw a heavy velvet curtain across the noise of the present and step quietly into a candle-lit hall of half-forgotten Bohemia. Stone walls breathe out the faint chill of centuries. Somewhere above, a small bronze bell tolls the hour in a voice barely louder than a sigh. Close your eyes, if you wish, and picture the long corridors of Prague Castle glowing amber beneath rows of flickering tapers. Smell the faint drift of pinewood smoke and feel the slow heartbeat of a distant city settling into night. Our companion in these hushed passages is Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia, a king born beneath gilded ceilings yet remembered, strangely, for his reluctance to rise from slumber. While storms brewed beyond palace windows, rebellious nobles, restless priests, swirling rumors, Wenceslaus often lingered in bedchambers scented with beeswax and lavender, choosing stillness over statesmanship, dreams over decrees. What thoughts fluttered behind his closed eyes? Did the weight of a crown press more softly when pushed aside for yet another drowsy dawn? As we wander his life together, let gentle questions guide us. How does power drift when its bearer drifts toward sleep? What echoes fill a council chamber left waiting for a monarch too weary to attend? There will be no clash of arms in this telling. No sudden trumpet blasts, only the slow tick of candle drips and the steady, padded steps of servants moving through shadowed rooms. Let the quiet of these moments cradle your thoughts, carrying you at the pace of an unhurried heartbeat. If drowsiness reaches for you, welcome it. Our story, like the king himself, will never hurry. We begin. Wenceslaus was born on a cool autumn morning in 1361, when mists curled over the Vltava River and dew beaded the copper roofs of Prague. In the royal nursery, silk banners hung like muted rainbows, crimson for courage, azure for faith. Yet the infant prince mostly saw the soft underside of linen canopies gently stirred by draught. His mother, Empress Anna, wrapped him in quilted wool the color of pale wheat. His father, the great Emperor Charles IV, murmured blessings in Latin so soft they floated like incense above the cradle. Childhood unfolded beneath rib-vaulted ceilings where frescoes of saints rested in perpetual patience. Tutors drilled Latin conjugations at a whisper, so as not to disturb morning nap times. When first he donned a tiny coronet, hammered silver twined with garnet roses, it sat light as down upon hair the hue of damp chestnuts. Pages buttoned his miniature tabard of quilted velvet, lined secretly with rabbit fur to keep the young prince warm during chapel vigils that often lulled him into gentle dozing. Prague Castle itself became a cradle. Fountains trickled lullabies in the courtyards. Swans on the moat glided in lazy ovals. The cathedral bells chimed the hours in lingering tones that seemed designed less to rouse than to soothe. Feast days came and went in slow procession. Platters of roast goose, flagons of honeyed wine, jongleurs plucking harps in minor keys. More than once, the boy king-in-waiting nodded off mid-mask, a jeweled goblet slipping from his small fingers onto a cushion conveniently placed by watchful stewards. At 15, Wenceslaus inherited the title King of the Romans, a lofty name that stretched from Bohemia to the Rhine. Yet titles, like heavy quilts, merely encouraged his longing for rest. Council scrolls arrived thick as winter blankets. He unrolled a few, skimmed lines until the ink blurred, then summoned another cushion. Courtiers grew adept at speaking in tones that matched his breathing, low, level, nearly musical. A crown of polished gold and blue enamel waited on its stand, but often he preferred a simple felt nightcap, softer on the brow and easier to forget. Thus the boy who dozed beneath painted saints matured into a man whose rule drifted, gentle and indistinct like fog above the river at dawn. History remembers Wenceslaus not for decrees carved in marble, but for sleeping through crises. The habit became almost ceremonial. Morning audience, delayed. Dawn bells clanged. Emissaries arrived in fur-lined cloaks dusted with frost. Still, thick curtains remained drawn around the royal bed. Inside, the king breathed slow and deep, quilts rising and falling like a tide. Chamberlains whispered at the threshold, parchment petitions curling in their hands, ink drying before a signature could form. Midday siesta, extended. If by chance Wenceslaus stirred, he conducted business from pillows. Decrees were dictated in a voice no louder than a confessional murmur, then sealed with a dangling wax drop that cooled before decisions left the room. Observers noted he lay beneath a canopy embroidered with drowsing lions. When sunlight slanted through stained glass, ruby and emerald flecks played across his eyelids. and the king slipped back into dreams. Council of Nobles rescheduled. Czech magnates gathered in the Vladislav Hall, their boots scuffing rushes on the floor. They spoke among themselves while a single page padded to and fro, relaying updates from the royal apartments. His Majesty is nearly ready. Hours passed, torches burned low. Eventually, nobles departed in a hush, their complaints as muffled as the king's breathing. Royal hunts missed. Horns blared at sunrise, hounds bayed, stirrups jingled. Yet Wenceslaus's saddle sat empty. Instead, he preferred twilight strolls through palace vineyards, slow circles that ended at a vine-covered gazebo where cushions waited beside a small silver flask. There he sampled warmed wine infused with poppy seeds, then reclined to watch bats wheel in the purple sky, eyelids fluttering shut before the first star. Night watches. Delegated. While city gates groaned closed and sentries leaned on halberds, the king was already deep within another cycle of slumber. Chroniclers recorded that he kept a personal collection of hourglasses, each designed to trickle sand for twice the ordinary time, ensuring naps stretched unbroken. These routines may sound trifling, yet their consequences rippled outward. Church reformers like Jan Hus preached fervently in Prague's Bethlehem Chapel, calling for change. Wenceslaus nodded, softly applauded, then failed to act. The German princes, wary of absentee oversight, convened at Rennes in 1400 and calmly deposed him as king of the Romans, an act he received, it is said, with a resigned sigh before rolling over to continue resting. Even punishments reflected the trance-like rhythm of his reign. When city burghers rioted over taxes, Wenceslaus ordered their leaders arrested. Then, before the ink on warrants dried, he forgot the order entirely, drifting into an afternoon nap scented with clover tea. Guards, unsure, merely loosened their grip on the prisoners and waited for clearer guidance that never came. Court jesters whispered a rhyme. Prague will burn or Prague will bloom, depending on when the king leaves his room. But they spoke it softly, mindful of echoing halls. Thus, Wenceslaus's strange habit, a monarchy practiced in slow motion, became its own law. The law of postponement, of parchment curling at the edges, of bells tolling unanswered and crises lulled into uneasy slumber. Inevitably, the kingdom's heartbeat quickened beyond the king's measured breaths. Nobles in Moravia sharpened grievances as surely as they sharpened swords. Burghers tallied lost coin while waiting for decrees that never arrived. In 1402, Wenceslaus's own brother Sigismund seized the moment, riding into Prague under banners that snapped sharply in the wind, banners that did not pause, did not whisper, did not sleep. Wenceslaus, surprised mid-siesta, surrendered without clangor. Captive now, he spent months in an Austrian castle high above the Danube, gazing through iron bars at circling swallows. Yet even imprisonment seemed to cradle him. Guards recorded how he slept soundly, meals untouched until cool, eyes half closed as if the chains themselves were merely heavier blankets. Released after delicate negotiations, he returned to Prague older, slower, and still weary. The realm around him, however, crackled with waking anger. Hus's followers demanded church reform. German towns bristled, papal envoys knocked like anxious woodpeckers. The king, too tired to rule, too gentle to crush rebellion, let matters simmer. His crown sat askew, more ornament than authority. On the 15th of August, 1419, Prague erupted. Followers of Hus stormed the new town hall, hurling officials from windows in the first defenestration of Prague. Wenceslaus, resting in Radchany gardens, reportedly heard distant shouts, sighed deeply, and, according to one chronicler, murmured, "Another burden," before collapsing into what witnesses deemed a final faint. Whether stroke or broken heart, the result was the same. A king who slept through most storms died in the hush of garden shade, cooled by late summer breezes brushing cypress leaves. They carried Wenceslaus's body up the echoing nave of St. Vitus Cathedral, candles bobbing like slow fireflies in the gloom. His coffin, oak-lined with brocade, was set beneath soaring vaults where sunlight filtered through ruby glass, bathing the scene in warm, muted red. Monks recited psalms in voices so level they might have been lullabies, an appropriate farewell for a king who favored sleep. Power passed to brother Sigismund, vigorous and resolute, yet the quiet habits of Wenceslaus left lingering shadows. Scrolls unopened for years were discovered in cedar chests, seals cracked like fragile eggshells when finally pried apart. Some decrees were enacted out of courtesy, most were burned for clarity, their ashes drifting in courtyard draughts like gray snow. Meanwhile, the Hussite Wars ignited, fiery sermons, marching peasant armies, war wagons creaking across Bohemian plains. Turmoil that might have been cooled sooner had a more wakeful monarch guided earlier days. Yet blame faded, replaced by a sighing acceptance that history moves at many tempos. Sometimes a gallop, sometimes the slow exhale of a sleeping king. Centuries later, tourists step softly over Wenceslaus's tombstone in the cathedral floor. Letters of his Latin name have worn smooth beneath pilgrim souls. Few pause long enough to read them. Outside, pigeons coo on parapets, and afternoon bells toll with the same measured cadence he once ignored. It is said the crypt air remains unusually cool, as though preserving one final unbroken dream. Every kingdom keeps a schedule, yet in Wenceslaus's Prague, that schedule resembled a lullaby composed for drowsy strings. At dawn, when other monarchs strode briskly into echoing halls, the Bohemian court began instead with silence, a silence so carefully cultivated that even sparrows seemed to hush their wings. The gentle rouse. Inside the royal apartments, servants slipped across parquet floors in soft felt slippers, bearing a silver ewer of rose-scented water and a towel warmed by the embers of an overnight brazier. On most mornings, they paused at the threshold, listening. If the king's breathing rose and fell in its familiar, ocean-slow rhythm, they retreated without knocking. On rarer mornings, when he stirred, a single valet whispered, "Good morrow, Majesty," no louder than the rustle of linen. The response, often a sigh shaped into half a word, signaled whether the day would advance or drift. Below, the castle kitchens prepared their own quiet overture. Barley porridge simmered in copper pots, quince compote blushed in glazed bowls, and a modest joint of venison roasted over low coals. Cooks spoke in coded gestures. Lids were lifted high to keep hinges from squeaking. Ladles rested on folded cloth instead of clattering pewter. Yet as hourglasses emptied, the footman assigned to fetch the king rarely came. By the second hour after sunrise, the porridge had developed a sleepy skin, and the compote's steam had surrendered to the chill air. At the third hour, cooks portioned the meal among underscullions, careful to use wooden spoons so even this consolation feast made no sound that might drift upward and wake their sovereign, the phantom audience. Meanwhile, dignitaries gathered in the audience hall, an expanse of rib-vaulted stone softened by rushes and tapers. Beneath the vast Gothic windows stood 3 circles of high-backed chairs, the innermost reserved for magnates, the middle for foreign envoys, the outer for hopeful petitioners. Daylight poured in, spilled across polished walnut, and lingered expectantly on the empty throne. As minutes stretched into hours, conversation adopted a reverent hush. A Silesian envoy discussed grain tariffs entirely in nods and scribbled notes. A Moravian bishop recited memorized arguments within his own mind, lips barely moving. A burgher from Kutna Hora fingered a coin purse whose contents were meant to grease a decision, were a decision ever to come. Every so often, the chamberlain crossed the marble floor, his soft-soled shoes whispering to report, "His Majesty is reflecting." The nobles bowed, though some lowered their heads just long enough to hide an exasperated blink. When the cathedral bell tolled sext, sunlight had traveled the length of the hall and come to rest upon the mosaic of St. Wenceslaus set into the floor, an unintended spotlight on the saintly namesake whose martyr aura seemed to watch over this gentler Wenceslaus with patient bemusement. Still, the king did not appear. Courtiers, hungry and numb, retreated to side chambers for thin slices of smoked carp and sweet black bread, the noon drift, they called it, food consumed in near silence lest the clink of a knife interrupt whatever dream guided royal thoughts. Whisper council in the cloisters. Yet business could not halt entirely. In the cloister walk north of the chapel garden, a makeshift council convened. Not at the granite table intended for state policy, but along a moss-rimmed stone bench where conversation defaulted to murmur. Documents were held up, not laid down, so that parchment would not scrape. Seals were broken by thumb rather than knife. One by one, nobles signed temporary accords, an extension of trade credit here, an informal ceasefire between quarreling barons there. Each signature bore a small drawn crescent beside it, an agreed symbol meaning pending royal eye-opening. The empire's gears turned, but only in half motion, like a mill wheel slowed by frost. The evening prelude. Toward vespers, palace staff prepared a second possibility. If, by miracle, Wenceslaus emerged, he would step into a tableau choreographed for quiet majesty. Choir boys lined the staircase, their first note held like a breath. Torches were lit yet shaded by frosted glass. The throne cushions were fluffed, then gently patted to release any captive dust. A herald rehearsed a welcome 3 times, each repetition softer than the last, dialing grandeur down to a lull. And still the corridor beyond the royal bed remained a corridor of waiting candles. When darkness finally swallowed the castle, the great bronze doors of the audience hall were eased shut, one at a time, with ropes threaded through iron rings to dampen every creak. Scribes gathered unsigned edicts and stored them in cedar chests, where lavender sachets masked the scent of stagnation. Torchbearers snuffed flames with padded caps, and the echo of each extinguished light resembled a distant exhale. In the royal apartments, the king's breathing continued, steady, measured, unwavering, while Prague below slipped into its own uneasy dreams. Thus the court of Wenceslaus moved according to a metronome set by sleep, agendas postponed, petitions quieted, ambition reduced to a patient shuffle. In that soft choreography of candle shadows and muffled steps, the realm discovered a curious equilibrium. Not progress, not decay, but a lingering twilight where time itself seemed to pause, as though respecting the sovereign's deep and endless rest. In quiet cedar-scented chests, beneath lids banded with worn bronze, lay scrolls that might have recharted Bohemia's course, had they ever found the warmth of urgency. These scrolls, gilt-edged and ribbon-tied, carried plans bright as sunrise, yet slumber-soft in practice. Tax relief for river merchants, forest charters to guard the silver first, statutes to spare villagers long marches to distant courts. Each parchment bore Wenceslaus's seal, an ivory disc pressed shyly into crimson wax, yet each also bore the hush of dreams deferred. A treasury that drowsed. Within the stone-arched counting room, clerks tallied coin by candlelight. Stacks of Prague groschen, newly minted, reflected amber glints against the vaulting. A proposal rested on the lectern. Introduce lighter copper pfennigs to ease the burden of everyday trade. It required only the king's spoken word to move from ink to metal, but that word drifted, caught somewhere between a yawn and a promise. So gold remained locked behind oak doors, and villagers continued to barter bolts of cloth for piglets, muttering that currency itself seemed asleep. Couriers without footsteps. A lattice of post roads, wide enough for 2 wagons to pass without scraping wheel, had been sketched in meticulous ink. Way stations, simple half-timbered inns with hayloft dormitories, dotted the margins like lanterns on a night map. Riders tested certain routes, hooves thudding on packed marl, yet the decree to formalize the network never left the royal study. Messengers grew accustomed to waiting. Saddles remained cinched, letters bound in leather tubes rested against their ribs, and horses lowered heads to doze, tails flicking slowly in time with swaying lanterns. The Forest Edict. South of Prague, broad forests whispered beneath moonlit canopies. Timber-hungry nobles felled oak and beech with a zeal sharper than their axes. Foresters, pressing petitions written in their best looping script, begged for a royal proclamation. Mark sacred groves, forbid logging during nesting seasons, fine any baron who stripped riverbanks bare. The king listened, brow furrowed with gentle concern. He twirled a quill, nodded twice, then asked that the draft be placed on the table of morning matters. Morning slipped quietly into afternoon, afternoon into twilight, twilight into years. New stumps dotted old hills, and nightingales sang from ever thinner hedges. Scholars in the cloister. At Charles University, founded by Wenceslaus's own father, scholars dreamed of a charter that would widen bursaries, translating Latin tomes into Czech so cobblers' sons and millers' daughters might read theology in their mother tongue. The professors even composed hymns in honor of a more literate future. They sent their manifesto bound with violet thread, hoping the royal eye would brighten at the thought of enlightened commoners. When no answer came, they rewrote the lines, this time in simpler prose, then sent it again, violet thread now faded to dusk gray. The scroll returned unopened, corner crushed where some gentle hand had used it as a makeshift doorstop to keep drafts from disturbing the royal sleep. Guild oaths and quiet quills. Prague's guildmasters, tanners, coopers, goldsmiths, assembled beneath a frescoed ceiling lacquered by candle smoke. They proposed uniform weights and measures to curb dishonest scales, shorter apprenticeships to fill empty workshops, and city watch patrols to walk cobbled lanes at moonrise. When the moment came to present these measures, the men spoke in tones polished by hope, each syllable hung with deference. A steward recorded their pleas. He promised to read them aloud beside the king's bedside, between one dream and the next, and so he did, his voice as steady as a lullaby, yet Wenceslaus smiled with eyelids closed, murmured something about harmony, and slipped again into deeper stillness. Parchment that curled. Time, indifferent, worked its slow alchemy. Ink faded from sable to willow smoke gray. Wax seals cracked, edges curling like winter leaves against a hearthstone. Yet the parchment did not burn. No decree was torn in anger or dismissed with disdain. Instead, each proposal rested, awaiting a dawn that never quite brightened beyond the rim of dream. The kingdom floated in a gentle suspension, neither ruin nor renaissance, its pulse matched to the king's measured breathing. Hope's quiet ritual. Notaries developed new habits. On the evening of every equinox, they carried a velvet-lined tray through antenna-still corridors to the royal door. On the tray, 5 scrolls of paramount import, each chosen by lot, each newly feather-dusted and trimmed. They placed the tray upon a low stool, lit a single beeswax taper, and withdrew. If by sunrise any scroll bore a fresh signature, bells would chime softly across the castle. Yet more often the taper expired with a sigh, leaving a pool of hardened honey gold and 5 untouched blessings. The murmuring city. Meanwhile, Prague murmured. Fishermen on the Charles Bridge spoke of tolls they feared but never paid. Tailors discussed new dye levies that never arrived. Millers worried about grain tariffs that remained rumor. In taverns, tankards clinked gently and voices stayed low, as if speaking too loudly might wake the slumbering possibility of change and invite the unknown. Lives adjusted themselves around absence, like vines bending quietly around an abandoned trellis. A throne as gentle as moss. Visitors from distant courts found the stillness unsettling. They had expected clangor and decree, banners and verdict. Instead, they walked soft-voiced through anterooms where ambition dozed. One Venetian ambassador was said to have whispered, "Bohemia is a land ruled by cushions." Yet even he could not deny the odd peace that lingered in that cushion-ruled realm. Crime low, harvests steady, wars postponed by collective indifference. It was as though the king's serenity seeped outward, instructing the realm by silent example to rest rather than rebel. So the reforms remained unfinished. Half-dreamed promises, parchment lullabies. And in their quiet suspension they shaped a kingdom as surely as forge and chisel. For sometimes history advances not by what kings decree, but by what they gently, persistently forget to do. When dawn's first gray peeled gently from Prague's slate rooftops, an hour too pale for politics and too tender for commerce, Wenceslaus sometimes shook off a feather of sleep and drifted, robe trailing, candle in hand, toward the hallowed stillness of St. Vitus Cathedral. He moved like a pilgrim within his own fortress, unguarded, unannounced, guided only by the faint tug of memory and organ pipe sighs that lingered in the stones. A quarter of breaths. The passage from royal chambers to cathedral cloister was long and windowless, lit by recessed niches where beeswax tapers burned under little bronze halos. Servants, warned by experience, kept their distance. Even a scuff of boot could jar the fragile calm. Thus the king walked alone, slippered feet whispering across rush-strewn flagstones, his breath clouding in the cool air. He liked, they said, the rhythm of his own breathing echoing back, 2 quiet steps, 1 measured inhale, candle flame shivering once, then still, the north door's low creak. At the cloister, an iron-hinged oak door yielded with a long sigh, as though it, too, had napped through the night. Beyond lay the nave, a midnight ocean of shadow walled by pillars so tall their capitals vanished into darkness. Wenceslaus paused on the threshold. A faint draft tugged the candle, sending light skittering across half-lit saints. Some kings pressed doorways as conquerors. Wenceslaus touched them as one might smooth a sleeping child's brow, reluctant to disturb whatever dreams a cathedral can keep. Candles and color. He crossed the nave not by the central aisle but along the northern side, where flickers from the votive altar painted soft amber ripples on the basalt floor. There he would light a second candle, always a simple taper, never a jeweled lamp, and set it close enough to warm the silver fingers of a sculpted archangel. The tiny flame multiplied itself in bossed gold leaf and shards of stained glass, sending pinpoints of sapphire and carmine pirouetting across the king's wool mantle. In that prismatic hush, Wenceslaus sometimes bowed his head so low that candle smoke curled into his hair like incense. Matins in whisper key. If he timed his visit just so, half an hour before the canons finished dressing, he could hear the first notes of matins without the full swell of choir and organ. The chant began behind the stone screen in a register softer than conversation, each syllable slipping into the next like silk cords crossing. Wenceslaus listened with closed eyes, palms open, letting the sound seep beneath his ribs. Some mornings the canons sensed him and softened further, reshaping Latin vowels until they floated weightless, more breath than voice. Other mornings they continued at ordinary volume, yet even then the king heard only lullaby. The rose window's slow bloom. Above the western portal hung the north rose window, a blossoming wheel of glass that greeted day in gradual petals. At first light, it showed only slate outlines. Then, as sun inched over the castle heights, individual panes kindled, topaz here, emerald there, until the entire rose flared like a hidden sunrise caught in stone. Wenceslaus loved that unfurling. Witnesses claimed he counted the panes as they woke, marking time not by bell or hourglass, but by the leisurely bloom of color. When the final amethyst lozenge brightened, he knew morning councils would soon muster, though not necessarily himself. Silent conversations. In those moments he sometimes spoke, not to clergy or saints, but to the void between echo and silence. A steward once recorded phrases overheard from behind a pillar. "Guide them gently," the king murmured, voice grainy with sleep. "Let them find their answers before they rouse me." Then, after a pause long as a prayer, "Keep tempests small." Whether these words addressed God, his absent father, or the pillars themselves, no one dared inquire. It was enough that the king spoke at all. A pew of dust motes. Wenceslaus often settled on the third pew from the transept, where a solitary shaft of light pierced the gloom, catching slow-moving dust in liquid gold. He watched those motes drift, rise, vanish, an unhurried ballet of particles, older than any crown. Some said he counted them too, or traced invisible constellations among their lazy orbits. And while he watched, time thinned to a hush so fine it could snap under the weight of a single footfall. Few dared enter then, lest the fragile quietude fracture. The clock hidden in stone. High in the tower, a small mechanical clock ticked. Its sound was swallowed by gargoyle throats and stone thickness, but Wenceslaus felt it, a subtle tremor beneath his boots, marking seconds he refused to obey elsewhere. Here, he accepted their passing. Each half-minute, the bell inside the clock offered a subdued plink, like a drop of water from stalactite to underground pool. It was rhythm enough to pace deep breaths, but never enough to urge decision. Departure, like a feather. As the chant neared its final amen, Wenceslaus rose, pressing fingertips to pew edge for balance. He pinched out his candle with thumb and forefinger, a trick learned from monks, leaving only the small white ghost of burnt wick. Turning, he retraced the side aisle, letting the choir finish behind him. He moved with such stillness that the extinguished taper's scent lingered longer than his footsteps. At the door, he paused again, perhaps to inhale the cathedral's cool breath one last time. Then he slipped through the corridor toward chambers where cushions waited and courtiers guessed. Outside, morning's business would clatter awake. Hoofbeats on cobbles, market bells, scribes unfurling scrolls that had slept as soundly as their sovereign. Yet inside St. Vitus the hush persisted, an after-echo of a king's quiet vigil. Stone absorbing sighs, saints blinking in colored light, and dust motes continuing their slow, unending waltz through a space where even history dared not raise its voice. Beyond the ramparts of Prague Castle, where battlements met the open sky and duty usually tightened its grip, stretched a terraced world far quieter than council halls, a world of vines. From a distance, those vines resembled green embroidery stitched across the hillside, each tendril looping patiently around weather-worn stakes. Wenceslaus loved them, not for their future barrels of wine, but for the hush they kept. A leaf could tremble there without comment. A cloud could pause and contemplate its own shadow, and herald's trumpet hurried either one along, the evening descent. Just before twilight, when cathedral bells sighed their seventh hour, the king sometimes roused himself, more from whim than obligation, and wandered down the sloped garden stairs. A single page, barefoot on grass to soften every step, followed at a respectful distance, carrying nothing but a lantern trimmed with frosted glass. Motes of dusk floated in its beam. Far below, between rows of Pinot Noir heavy with late summer grapes, stood a small gazebo, octagonal, cedar-framed, half-draped in ivy, so thick it looked like a living mantle. Pale blossoms of night-scented stock climbed the posts, releasing a fragrance cool as linen washed in stream water. Before reaching the last stair, the king gestured. The page halted. Wenceslaus preferred to take the final path alone, a narrow earthen ribbon cushioned by moss. The lantern's glow faded behind him, replaced by a softer radiance. The low orange of westering sun diffused through vine leaves, each leaf trembling in slow applause as evening's breeze wound through the trellises. Cushions, waiting in quiet. Inside the gazebo waited a circle of cushions, embroidered once in vivid scarlet, but now faded to the color of mellow plums. An attendant had arranged them earlier with monastic care. One to cradle the spine, one for knees if the king wished to kneel in thought, another small square, stuffed with goose down, to serve as footrest. On a table carved from walnut sat a silver ewer of warmed wine steeped with poppy seed, crushed clove, and a shaving of cinnamon bark. Beside it lay a delicate clay cup, thin enough that light could pass through the rim, and a flat dish of honeyed almonds. A parchment note in crisp secretary hand reminded any server, "Pour only at a whisper." Wenceslaus entered without announcement, closed the lattice door, and stood for a moment letting dusk settle onto his shoulders like an old cloak. Overhead, beams met in a star pattern, each joint secured by a wooden peg just visible beneath tendrils of ivy. Small hollows housed earlier candle stubs. Tonight no flame was needed. Twilight itself was illumination enough, cool and steady. A sip that slowed time. He poured 3 fingers of mulled wine, the liquid catching a faint glow, part sunset, part reflection of his own candle gold memories. The first sip traveled warm and slow, loosening every hinge of thought until mind and body both adopted the tempo of vine and soil. Each swallow ended in a low exhale, barely a sound, more a soft permission for muscles to release their hold. Some evenings, after 2 or 3 such sips, he leaned back against the largest cushion and simply looked. Vineyard rose led the eye down toward the distant Vltava, whose surface shimmered pewter in failing light. Bats, small as thrown leaves, cut silent arcs through the air, their wings parting dusk like fingertips through gauze. Fireflies sparked here and there amid tall meadow grass, their pulses neither hurried nor delayed by any royal schedule. Conversations with the vines. It was said the king spoke during these vigils, though never loud enough for anyone outside the gazebo to distinguish words. Perhaps he addressed the grapes, promising a harvest feast he'd never quite planned. Perhaps he whispered to his father's memory, or to the saint whose chapel bell echoed faintly uphill. Whatever the subject, the vines accepted every syllable with stoic grace, their leaves fluttering in what might have been agreement, might have been mere wind. A kestrel's call, far off, sometimes punctuated the monologue, landing softly between phrases, as though nature herself offered quiet commentary. When no words rose, Wenceslaus folded into silence so deep that ivy tendrils could be heard creaking minutely as they stretched another millimeter along cedar beams. The lute's solitary strain. On rare nights, a single court musician, tasked with holding all melodies at the tip of one finger, waited beyond the vines. If the king placed 2 honeyed almonds on the table, that was the sign. The lute should begin. No fanfare, no chord progression, just a lone string plucked every few breaths, then another, each note hanging like dew until it evaporated into the cooling air. Between notes, cicadas filled the empty bars with a soft timbre, and distant frogs answered from reed-fringed banks. Wenceslaus's eyelids drooped. When they closed fully, his head dipped but never jolted. Instead, the realm inside that gazebo tilted imperceptibly into reverie. Some claim that in sleep he smiled. Not a diplomatic smile, but the smile of someone who hears water burbling under moss and knows all is well for the moment. The star lantern. Eventually the page returned. Lantern now lit with starlight rather than oil, its frosted panes reflecting specks of sky. Wenceslaus opened his eyes at the faint crunch of grass, though he did not rise immediately. He observed one planet, bright, unmoving, in the western heavens, then pressed fingertips to the stem of his goblet as if memorizing its gentle warmth before night's deeper chill. He left the gazebo as he had entered, without ceremony. Cushions remained indented, cup half empty, lute silent. Behind him vines rustled, not in farewell, but in continuation of their own secret conversation, one that would persist though kings slept, or altered crowns. Back at the ramparts, the castle's watchfires flickered awake, but down in the vineyard the only blaze came from constellations. And if anyone stood at a distance and looked up, they might think the small cedar gazebo, ivy-wrapped and quiet, was itself a dark star fallen gently to earth, glowing with the last residue of a monarch's peaceful, unhurried heart. Last, most fragile watch of night, those scant heartbeats just before sunrise, belonged entirely to whispers. Palace timekeepers called it Wenceslaus's watch, for in that hush the king's measured breathing seemed to govern every lamp, every heartbeat, every cautious footfall within Prague Castle. The palace that listens. Beneath star-paled rafters, the whole fortress tuned itself to a single, invisible metronome. Chandeliers, long since snuffed, held wax tears that cooled in slow spirals. Hearth embers lay in velvet ash, glowing faintly like coals seen through closed eyelids. Even the banners hung motionless, their silks conserving what little motion remained in the world. Only one observable rhythm persisted, the gentle lift and fall of a velvet curtain each time the king exhaled through a half-open window high above the courtyard. Servants, those practiced disciples of stillness, rose from pallets tucked behind cellar arches. They tied shoes without knots lest laces scrape stone, and wrapped aprons thrice around waists so no loose corner could flap against air. They stepped through corridors on felt soles, whispers passing between them like hand-to-hand lanterns. The night is calm. His Majesty sleeps. Let the hush continue. The clock of small sounds. Somewhere in the depths of the castle ticked a water clock. A bronze basin receiving droplets at intervals determined by moon-pulled reservoirs on the roof. Each drip landed with a note closer to sigh than splash, marking seconds too soft for calculation, yet too persistent to vanish. Servants measured their tasks, polishing of pewter flagons, folding of linen towels, to that watery cadence. If a droplet echoed twice before a chore was complete, the pace was too brisk. If 5 drops fell, the servant slowed further, seeking an even gentler equilibrium. Courtyard, resting in breath mist. Outside, the courtyard lay under a light frost, cobbles shining like fish scales in moon residue. Stable boys led horses to water by grasping manes rather than halters, guiding hooves as though each clop might crack the crystal silence. The animals seemed to understand. They moved with knees half-bent, tails still, steam curling from nostrils in discreet ribbons that vanished before reaching lamp height. A single owl glided overhead, wings cutting the air in noiseless halves, then perched upon the weather vane, turning its head not with a snap but with a reverent, deliberate swivel. Kitchen fires that dare not roar. In the palace, cooks coaxed coals into timid life. They fanned embers with bundled pheasant feathers, raising heat but forbidding flame. Porridge pots were set on trivets, not hooks, so iron would not clang. A single ladle stirred barley in half arcs. The barley itself swirled quietly, grains colliding like soft applause. If the porridge hissed, a cook removed the lid, allowing a cool kiss of air to soothe the surface. Over time, the scent, milk warmed with nutmeg, crept along scullery walls, but even odors tiptoed, refusing to break the wonted stillness. The page in the antechamber. Nearest the king, in the antechamber draped with midnight blue tapestries, a young page sat on a 3-legged stool, holding a covered tray. On it, 2 slices of honey-crusted bread, a fig, and a parchment scroll no larger than his palm. The scroll contained the day's single tiniest permission for the cathedral canons to repair a cracked choir stall. The page's instructions were clear: offer the tray only if the king stirs of his own accord. He practiced breathing in sets of 4, inhale, hold, exhale, pause, until his pulse matched the rhythm of distant water drops. Through a gap in the curtained doorway, he could just discern the faint mound of the king's form beneath quilts, one tuft of chestnut hair catching moonlight. Occasionally a sigh drifted outward, long and untroubled, and the page felt, momentarily, wondrously, responsible for guarding the very continuity of that breath. A city poised on the edge of day, beyond castle walls, Prague itself hesitated. Shop shutters remained latched, yetchers of bread ovens waited to stoke fires. Fishermen on the Vltava gripped oars but did not row. The Charles Bridge, stone lions glazed with dew, stretched from bank to bank like a held-in breath. River mist hovered knee-high, blurring cobbles into dream-paved causeway. In taverns, night watchmen nursed the dregs of mulled beer, speaking in murmurs lest their words leak upstairs to rooms where children still floated in half-sleep. The hush was almost superstitious. Townsfolk believed the kingdom's fate hung on the fragile boundary between the king's dream and his waking. To disturb one might shatter the other. So they waited, balancing crates, halting mill wheels mid-turn, leaving church doors ajar but footsteps on hold. When silence breaks like dawn itself inevitably, a moment arrived, though not always at the same minute, when the eastern sky whitened like parchment held to flame. Birds risked a first tentative cheep. The water clock inside the wall offered a louder droplet as if challenging the hush. If Wenceslaus continued to sleep, quiet held a little longer, sweet and tremulous. But if he shifted, just a rustle of linen, a faint clearing of throat, the castle thawed. The page rose, knees prickling, and advanced one silent shoe length. The scroll trembled slightly on the tray. On fortunate mornings, the king opened his eyes, accepted the bread, and murmured a single consent. Bells would then toll, not in exultation, but in a soft, rolling peal that crept outward to the city like morning light itself. Merchants unbarred stalls, scullery fires brightened, barges untied, and day began, shy, cautious, but undeniably begun. If slumber holds more often, however, Wenceslaus's eyes remained lidded. The page stepped back, breath still knitted to the water clock, and the scroll awaited another dawn. Outside, tradesfolk exchanged patient glances and slid once raised shutters down again. Horses nickered, then resumed their stone-still posture. And life in Bohemia pressed a finger to its lips, honoring the sovereign's unbroken dream. Thus, each dawn repeated its delicate ritual, a kingdom standing tiptoe on the edge of action, poised between heartbeat and hush, learning, as vines did, as dust motes in St. Vitus did, to bloom in stillness, to find quiet purpose in the sovereign silence of whispers before dawn. The candles have guttered low now, their flames no more than quiet beads of amber winking in the dark. We have lingered in Bohemia's shadowed corridors and followed the gentle drift of a king whose greatest decree was silence. From the lull of his nursery to the hush of St. Vitus, from vine-scented twilight to the breath-held hours before dawn, Wenceslaus IV showed us that a life can flow not in shouts but in murmurs, like a river gliding beneath morning mist. Let those murmurs settle softly around you. Breathe once, slowly, as the king once breathed beneath quilted velvets. Breathe again and feel the hush gather like a cloak across your shoulders. Whatever tasks still clamor at the edge of thought, set them aside as unrolled scrolls left waiting for a gentler dawn. In this moment, nothing is urgent. The world beyond these words can wait, as Bohemia once waited. Patient, unhurried, and strangely at peace. Close your eyes if you've not closed them already, and imagine the distant toll of a bronze bell fading into night. Picture dust motes spinning lazily in a single shaft of moonlight, or vines swaying in a breeze too soft to name. Hold that quiet picture, just for a breath longer, and let it guide you toward rest. May your dreams wander only through tranquil halls. May your worries drift like fog above the river at dawn. Thank you for sharing this hushed voyage through time. Sleep now, gentle listener. Good night, and may your dreams be quiet tonight.